barefoot girl dragged herself across a marble corridor and left a thin red line behind her. The thing she carried was heavy and bleeding, and her arms trembled under its weight. Boots rang at the far end of the hall, and a long shadow swung up to meet her. A halberd lowered toward her chest. A guard's pale hand rose. She did not stop walking. She did not look at the blade. She kept her eyes on the oak doors at the end of the corridor. The thing in her arms made a soft, ragged sound, and she pressed her cheek down against its dark fur. A second halberd lowered behind her, blocking the way back. 3 more guards stepped into the candlelit hall from the side arches. The girl was called Cressida, and she had walked 7 nights to reach this floor. Stay with me on this one. 7 nights before, Cressida had been on her knees in the dirt outside the village of Hollowmere, sorting boiled herbs by candlelight while her grandmother slept in the small cottage behind her. The village had stopped speaking to her family a year before, when the council had decided her grandmother's healing trade was no longer welcome inside the wall. The 2 of them lived now in a half-collapsed stone cottage on the wrong side of the boundary brook. They ate what the forest gave them. They sold nothing, and they asked for nothing. Cressida was 19 winters old and had never known any other home. Her mother had died of fever when she was 6, and her father had not been seen in her life at all. The grandmother, a long-faced witch named Brine, had raised her on tisanes and old songs and the careful patience that comes from being unwelcome. Brine had 2 rules and only 2. The first rule was to never lie to a sick body about its sickness. The second rule was to never refuse a wounded creature. Cressida had been 4 years old the first time she carried home a wounded thing on her own. It had been a small gray field mouse with a broken back, and she had laid it on her palm and walked all the way back to the cottage door without setting it down. Brine had taken the mouse from her, set it gently on the kitchen rag, and shown her how to mix the small red drop that would ease its passing. The mouse had died in the night with no pain. Cressida had buried it in a hollow under the back hedge before dawn. She had been carrying wounded things home ever since. The village had not always been closed to them. There had been a time, in Cressida's earliest memory, when her grandmother walked the village square at full noon with a willow basket on her arm and the small village children running at her heels. Brine had stitched cuts on every farmer's hand in 2 valleys. She had pulled 3 breech babies into the world and lost none of them. She had been called mother by every woman in Hollowmere for 30 years. That night the wounded creature came out of the trees, the way a stone falls down a stair. It crashed through the low brush at the back of the cottage and collapsed onto the path. Cressida heard it before she saw it. She lifted her candle, and the candle found a long lean shape with dark gray fur and a torn shoulder, breathing fast and shallow. The eyes lifted to her. The eyes were brown and very tired. She set the candle down. She did not call to her grandmother. She walked forward slowly and held out both hands, palms up, so the creature could see she carried no blade. The creature did not growl. It only watched her. She knelt beside it and laid her cheek down against the matted fur of its neck and listened to its heart. The heart was beating, but it was working too hard. She cleaned the shoulder wound with boiled water and the last of her grandmother's wound paste. She wrapped the shoulder with strips torn from her own shift. She brought the creature inside the cottage and laid it on the rag rug beside the low fire. She named it nothing, because the wounded creature already had a name and she only had to wait to learn it. By morning she knew the creature was a wolfhound, lean and tall and gray, with the long muzzle and the heavy paws and the steady eyes of a working pack dog from far to the north. She also knew, by the iron collar half buried in the fur of his neck, that he belonged to someone who could read the language stamped into the iron. Brine examined the collar by the morning window and went very still. She turned it over in her thin old hands twice. She held it up to the cold light. She traced one fingertip along the stamped marks. The marks were not in the merchant tongue. They were not in the village tongue. They were in the old midnight tongue that only the courts of the Eastern Reach used in their kennels and their private papers. Brine had not seen those marks in 60 years. She did not tell Cressida what the iron said. She said only that the hound must be returned to the place the iron belonged, and that the place was the high castle of the vampire king 2 valleys to the east, and that no mortal walked into that castle alive. Cressida looked down at the hound on the rug. The hound looked back at her. He had stopped trembling in the night, and his breathing was slow now. She told her grandmother that she would walk the hound to the castle on her own. Brine did not argue with her. Brine had stopped arguing with her granddaughter a long time before, because she had learned that her granddaughter heard the same quiet voices that she herself heard, and those voices did not take well to argument. Brine packed her a small bundle of dried roots and a flask of water and a long woven cloak. She also pressed a small carved bone into Cressida's hand and folded the fingers closed. The bone was warm. Cressida did not ask what it was. Brine did not say. The hound could not walk. Cressida bound him in her cloak across her shoulders, the way a shepherd carries a lamb, and she set out before dawn on the long road east. The road climbed through pine forest and crossed 3 streams and skirted a black volcanic ridge. She rested every 2 hours. She fed the hound small strips of dried meat from her bundle and dripped water from her flask into his mouth. He did not growl when she lifted him. He did not whimper when she set him down. He bore the journey the way an old soldier bears a long march, with quiet patience and steady breath. The first night she slept in a shallow cave above the 2nd stream, with the hound curled against her side for warmth. She did not light a fire because she had no flint and no time to learn one in the dark. The cold seeped through her cloak and her shift and her thin, bare skin. She did not shiver. She had been cold so often in her life that the cold had stopped being a thing to fight. She listened to the hound's slow breath and matched her own to his, and the matching kept her warm enough. The second night she slept under a fallen pine on the high ridge above the 3rd stream. A small fox stopped at the edge of her sleep and stared at her for a long, quiet moment with bright yellow eyes. The hound, even half asleep, made the same low warning sound he had made on the pass road. The fox listened to the sound, lowered its sharp ears, and slipped away into the darker pine. Cressida slept again. On the morning of the 4th day, she crested the high pass and saw the eastern reach laid out below her for the first time in her life. It was darker than the western valleys. The trees were taller and the sky lower. A long black road wound across the floor of the valley toward the cliff where the castle stood. She did not stop to look. She started down the pass. The hound was lighter on her shoulders now, which she did not think was a good sign. She walked faster. On the 3rd night, a man stepped out of the trees in front of her on the high pass road. He wore a hooded oilcloth and a long curved knife at his belt. He told her to set the hound down and walk away. She did not. He took 1 step forward, and the hound in her cloak lifted his head and made a sound deep in his chest that was not a growl. It was lower than a growl. It was the sound a wolfhound makes when he has decided that the next breath he takes will be his last unless something changes. The man in the oilcloth listened to the sound, took 1 step back, and disappeared into the trees the way he had come. Cressida walked on. By the 5th night, her bare feet were torn open across the bottoms, and she was leaving a thin red trail on the dust of the road. She did not stop. By the 6th night, the pine forest fell away, and the high castle of the vampire king rose out of the cliff like a black iron tooth. By the 7th night, she had passed through the outer gate, which a guard had opened for her without speaking, because he had not believed his eyes, and she had walked the long marble corridor of the inner ward, and she had reached the floor outside the throne room with the wounded hound still bound in her cloak. Now here is the thing. Every guard in that castle had standing orders to drain any mortal who set foot on the inner ward without invitation. The orders had been in force for 400 years. They were not orders that were debated. They were not orders that were softened by mercy or pity or charm. They were not orders that bent for women, or for children, or for the bleeding, or for the barefooted. They were orders that were obeyed. The outer guard at the great iron gate had broken the orders the moment he opened the gate for Cressida. He had done it because she had walked up to the gate, lifted her face to the iron grill, and said only one thing. She had said the name of the wolfhound in her arms. She had not known she was saying it. She had said it the way a tired traveler says any small true thing at the end of a long road. The outer guard had heard the name. The name was Bran. The outer guard had served the king's pack train through the great storm 3 winters before. He knew the name. He opened the gate. He had then sent a runner ahead on the long marble corridor to warn the inner guard, but the runner had been too slow, and the inner guard had not been told in time. That was why Veron had lowered his halberd at her chest. That was why the 4 other guards from the side arches had bracketed her in a tense crescent of polished iron. They had not yet been told what the outer guard had heard at the gate. The captain of the inner guard, a tall pale lord called Veron, lowered his halberd toward Cressida's chest in the corridor. He waited for her to stop walking. She did not stop. He sharpened his voice. He told her to lay down the bundle. She did not lay down the bundle. She walked the next 3 steps toward the great oak doors. Veron lifted his halberd again. Behind her 3 guards from the side arches lowered their halberds in a tight crescent. Cressida was bracketed on 4 sides by polished iron. She stopped. She turned her face toward Veron. Her eyes were the color of cold river water. She said only one thing. She said that she had walked 7 nights and she had only one request, and the request was a cup of water. She did not ask for her life. She did not ask for mercy. She asked for water. Then she turned back toward the oak doors and she pushed them open with her shoulder, because her arms were still wrapped around the hound, and she walked into the throne room of the vampire king. The throne room was lit by hundreds of small candles in iron sconces along the high walls. The floor was black marble veined with silver. At the far end on a stepped dais sat the throne of antler and iron, and on the throne sat the king. He wore long dark robes and a thin iron circlet at his brow. He had a long pale face and very still hands. He was Aurelius, the vampire king of the eastern reaches, and he had ruled from that throne for 312 years. He watched the girl walk the length of his throne room. He watched the guards trail her in a tense crescent behind. He watched the small red footprints she left on the black marble. He watched the long gray muzzle of the hound lift weakly from her shoulder. He did not move. Cressida walked the length of the floor and stopped at the foot of the dais. She lowered herself slowly to one knee. She unbound the cloak from across her shoulders and laid the hound carefully on the cold marble at the king's boots. She bent forward until her forehead nearly touched the stone. Then she lifted her face and looked the king in the eye, which no mortal in 312 years had done while still kneeling at his throne, and she said again, very softly, that her only request was a cup of water. The throne room did not breathe. Veron behind her did not breathe. The 4 other guards along the wall did not breathe. The king leaned forward on his throne. He looked at the long gray hound at his boots. He looked at the iron collar, half buried in the fur of the hound's neck. He looked at the long-faced girl kneeling on his black marble. He went very still. He rose from the throne. He stepped down the dais on his long, quiet boots. He knelt on one knee on the cold marble beside the hound. He laid his pale hand on the hound's chest and felt the steady beating of the heart beneath the matted fur. He read the iron collar with his pale fingertips, the way an old reader reads a familiar book in the dark. Then he lifted his face slowly and looked at Cressida, and for the first time in 300 years, there was something in the eyes of the vampire king that the throne room did not recognize. He spoke very quietly. He told her to give him her name. She gave it. He asked her grandmother's name. She gave that too. The name rang in the throne room like a struck bell. The king closed his pale eyes for one long breath. Then he opened them. He turned to Veron at the foot of the throne and gave a single quiet command. Veron's halberd touched the marble. Veron's face went the color of bone. Veron turned and ran from the throne room to fetch the court physician. The king turned back to Cressida. He told her, in a voice as quiet as a candle, that she was safe in his castle, that the hound at her feet was a pack dog of his own line lost 3 winters ago in the great storm, and that her grandmother Brine had once saved the life of his own younger sister from a wasting fever, in a time so long ago that no living vampire in his court remembered it but him. He told her that she would not be harmed. He told her that the cup of water she had asked for would be brought in a silver chalice. He told her that the Queen's old chambers, sealed since the Queen's passing 19 years before, would be opened that evening and the bed prepared for her own rest. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. The court physician arrived within the hour. He was a small, careful lord called Pavel, with the long, thin fingers of a man who had stitched 1,000 wounds in his long life. He carried a basket of bone needles, a small jar of dark blood paste, and a roll of soft linen washed in moonwater. He set his basket down beside the Hound. He knelt at the Hound's side and began his work. He cleaned the shoulder wound that Cressida had already cleaned. He praised the wound paste her grandmother had made and asked Cressida the name of the root in it, and when she told him, he nodded once and said it was the right root, and most physicians of the court had forgotten the recipe. He stitched the deeper tear with a long curved needle of bone, and he wrapped the shoulder in a fresh strip of soft linen. While he worked, a servant brought Cressida her cup of water. It was a silver chalice with 3 small carved ravens around the rim. The water was cold and clean, and she drank it slowly because she had not had clean water in 3 days. When she had finished the chalice, she set it down on the marble. The servant brought her a second chalice. She drank that too. By the 3rd chalice she was crying without sound. She did not know why. The vampire king did not look away. When the physician had finished, the Hound lay quiet on the cold marble with his bandaged shoulder and his eyes closed. The king lifted him in his own arms, the way a father lifts a sleeping son, and carried him to a low couch the steward had brought into the throne room. He laid the Hound on the couch and arranged the blanket over his side. He turned back to Cressida. He extended one pale hand to her. She placed her own small torn hand in his. He lifted her to her feet. Veron, the captain of the guard, came forward at a signal. He did not look the girl in the eye, because he did not yet know how. He told her that the Queen's chambers were prepared. He told her that a hot bath was drawn. He told her that a long soft robe of dark wool had been laid out on the bed. He bowed low, the bow he reserved for the high lords of the inner council, and then he stood aside and waited for her to walk past. Cressida did not walk past at once. She turned to the king. She asked him very quietly what the Hound's name was. The king watched her for a long moment. Then he told her. The Hound was called Bran. He had been the smallest of 3 brothers from the same litter, and the 3 brothers had ridden the king's pack train into the great storm 3 winters before. The other 2 had been lost to the snow. Bran had been the one the king had grieved hardest. Bran had been the one the king had never stopped listening for in the long nights of the Eastern Reach. She nodded. She bent over the low couch and laid her hand on Bran's gray muzzle. Bran opened his tired eyes once and looked at her. She whispered something to him that no one in the throne room heard, not even the vampire king, and she straightened. She followed the captain of the guard out of the throne room toward the long sealed corridor that led to the Queen's old chambers. By moonrise that night the castle had received 2 more visitors at the outer gate. They were not mortals. They were not nobles. They were a pair of long gray wolfhounds with matted fur and torn paws, and the same iron collars stamped with the language only the king could read. They were the 2 brothers of Bran, the ones the king had thought lost to the great storm 3 winters before. They had been living, somehow, in the high pine forest of the Eastern Reach, surviving on what the forest gave them, waiting for one of their bloodline to come home and call them. Bran was the one who called them. He could not stand to do it, but from the low couch in the throne room he lifted his bandaged head and made a single long note that carried out through the high windows of the castle and rolled across the cliff. The 2 brothers, who had been lying in a thicket 2 valleys to the east, heard the note. They rose. They walked through the night. By moonrise they were at the outer gate, side by side, waiting for the iron to be lifted. Veron lifted the iron himself. He had been told to expect them. He led them through the inner ward, past the candlelit cathedral and the long marble corridor, into the throne room. The vampire king stood up from his throne when the doors opened, and he watched in silence as the two gray brothers crossed the black marble and reached the low couch where Bran lay. They lowered their heads. They touched their noses, one and then the other, to Bran's bandaged shoulder. Then they laid themselves down on the marble on either side of the couch, the way a guard dog lies down at the foot of a master's bed, and they did not move for the rest of the night. The vampire king wept then for the first time in 19 years. He did not weep loudly. He simply lifted one pale hand and pressed it against his face, and let the silent tears slip down between his fingers. Veron, standing at the doorway, lowered his halberd to the marble and bowed his head and did not look up. Pavel the physician, who had remained at the couch through the long evening, set down his small basket of stitching tools and rested both his careful hands on the king's shoulder. No one in the throne room spoke. They did not need to. The last time the king had wept had been on the morning his queen Selene had finally closed her eyes for good, in the queen's chamber, with the long sealed corridor outside her door. He had not wept at her burial. He had not wept at the candle lighting on each of the 19 anniversaries since. He had not wept on the night his pack train rode out into the great storm, and 3 of his oldest wolfhounds did not ride back. He had carried his grief the way a king carries an iron crown, heavy, polished, and never set aside in front of witnesses. Tonight the crown had slipped. It had slipped because a long-faced girl from a half-collapsed cottage had walked 7 nights to bring him a piece of his heart back, and because the 2 brothers of that piece had arrived at his gate with torn paws of their own, and because the candlelit cathedral of his long quiet grief had finally, at last, been given a reason to open its doors. Cressida, in the queen's old chambers down the long sealed corridor, did not yet know any of this. She only knew that her feet were warm for the first time in a week, and that the long dark robe of wool smelled faintly of dried lavender, and that she could hear 3 wolfhounds breathing slowly in unison just outside her chamber door. She closed her eyes. The bone in her cloak pocket, the small carved bone her grandmother had pressed into her hand on the morning she walked out into the dawn, was warm against her hip. She did not take it out. She did not need to. It had done its work. Cressida slept that night in the queen's old chambers for the first time in 19 years. The bed was tall and dark, and the sheets smelled faintly of dried lavender from a bowl that had been refreshed every full moon by a servant whose only task was the lavender. She did not dream. She slept the deep flat sleep of a body that had walked 7 nights with a wounded hound in its arms, and could finally, at last, set the weight down. In the morning she woke to the sound of 3 wolfhounds breathing slowly in unison, just outside her chamber door. She rose. She wrapped the long dark robe of wool around her shoulders. She opened the door. The 3 gray brothers lay across her threshold like a quiet wall. Bran lifted his bandaged head and made a soft welcoming note in his throat. The other 2 beat their tails once each against the marble. Behind them at the end of the long corridor stood the vampire king in his long dark robes, with a silver chalice of warm broth in one hand and a thin smile on his pale face. He bowed his head to her, the way an old host bows to an honored guest, and he asked her if she would consent to walk the gardens of the inner ward with him after she had broken her fast. She nodded. She closed the chamber door behind her. The 3 wolfhounds rose and followed her down the corridor, as if they had been following her down it for 100 years. In the candle-lit cathedral that evening, the king knelt at the cold stone altar where his queen had once knelt, and he gave silent thanks for 2 things. He gave thanks for the long-faced witch in the half-collapsed cottage on the wrong side of the Boundary Brook, who had taught her granddaughter to never refuse a wounded creature. And he gave thanks for the long, quiet years that lay ahead, in which his 3 wolfhounds would learn the corridors of the castle again, and a long-faced girl from a forgotten village would learn the small ways a kingdom is run, and a sealed chamber would be sealed no longer, because the bed inside it was warm again at last. The next morning the king sent a small quiet rider west with a sealed parchment for brine, and a wagon behind him loaded with dried meat and milled flour, and 3 bolts of soft wool cloth, and a small iron-bound chest of silver coin. The parchment was a single short sentence in Brine's own old tongue, in the king's careful pale hand, asking only if she would consider rejoining a court that had been wrong 3 lifetimes ago to let her sister die without a healer. Brine read the parchment by the morning window of the half-collapsed cottage and laid it down on the table and lit a small candle beside it, and said one word aloud to the empty room. The word was the kind of word an old healer says when she has been waiting 60 years to be asked. She did not return to the court at once. She wrote a long, careful reply and sent it back with the writer. The reply began an exchange of letters that lasted the rest of her long life. Cressida walked the gardens of the inner ward with the king every morning after that, for a full year, with the 3 wolfhounds at her heels. She learned the names of the small gray doves the late queen had loved. She learned which herbs grew on which side of the wall. She learned the names of the inner council, one by one, and the names of the small, careful servants who tended the candles in the long, sealed corridor that was no longer sealed. She did not become a queen. She never asked to. She became, instead, the long-faced girl who walked the gardens of the inner ward, and that was a thing the Eastern Reach had not had in 19 years, and the having of it healed the kingdom in ways no edict ever could. Bran lived another 9 years. He died in his sleep, on the rug beside the throne, with Cressida's small hand resting between his ears. The other 2 brothers lived 4 years after that. The vampire king ruled for 200 more years, and through all of those years there was a long woven cloak hung on a brass hook beside the great oak doors of the throne room, and beneath the cloak there was a small carved bone that an old witch had pressed into her granddaughter's hand on the morning she walked out into the dawn. The king never let either of them be moved. They are still there,